Hi class, I created this video to kind of touch on some highlights of this famous chapter, this famous book called Critical Theory Today by Tyson. And I assigned chapter 4, Feminist Criticism. And in my English 101, 1A classes, I teach a strategy called chunking, where I might read a paragraph, 2 or 3, but whatever I feel like the writer has kind of made a point and has moved on to another point, I stop and I kind of sum it up in my own words. So I did that. I'm just going to touch on some of the key points of this chapter to help you out. But it's not going to take the place of reading it, so it might be a good idea to read it as well. So let's see. So to begin with, after the first paragraph, she kind of talks about, she claims that feminism gets a bad rap because oftentimes people take the most objectionable thing that they might have heard about it, right? The most negative thing, and that's kind of what they roll with, right? So they take the most objectionable thing that they've heard about feminism, and they use that as the basis by which they judge the theory, which of course is often negative. So in many ways, right, if you think back to if you took your English 102 class, critical thinking, this is, not being a logical thinker, right? You're actually kind of being biased. So in a way, she's kind of explaining how the theory has gotten a bad rap because of that, because people tend to focus on the negative. Okay? Then in the next section, she refers to the use of the pronoun he. Many people think, well, what's the big deal? Who cares if you call both women and women guys or he? Well, she kind of explains that, and that's my second chunk. Basically, she claims that something that seems trivial, like using the pronoun he as a catch-all term to describe men and women, is actually problematic because it perpetuates the idea that life is seen through a male point of view. And she talks about her next paragraph, she explains why that's bad, and that's the next kind of section that I chunked here. Let me find it. So basically, she talks about how female writers continue to be marginalized, right? She even talks about this list of a most recent critic where he talks about kind of the golden age of American literature being like the 20s. So in other words, when F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. And even then, there is only one woman, right, who has made the list, right? So one woman who is part of, quote unquote, the literary canon. So she argues in this next section that female authors continue to be marginalized, and even if women have gained popularity as writers, as many women have, they're still not considered great or part of the canon, which provides rational, right, for a feminist perspective. Okay? And then that was chunk 3. Moving on to chunk 4, it's right here. She talks about how the idea of male dominance is seen outside of the literary world, right? And she talks about how male subjects are often used as test subjects for medical trials. And I actually think there's a lot of truth to this because I just seen something recently about this new COVID vaccine. And I think the majority, if not all, of the people who are undergoing this trial are men. And that's also problematic because there may be side effects for women, right, that they had never contemplated or never thought of because only male subjects were used to go through with the protocols, okay? So in that section there, she kind of expands upon it. Then this next section, she calls it traditional gender roles. So we'll skip on down to my next chunk, which was right around page 86. And basically, Tyson argues that gender is a social construct. Sex is biological, right? We are born a man, we are born a woman. But once people are born, they are categorized into how each sex is supposed to act. For example, females are considered weaker, right, because they are more emotional. And she uses the term hysterical, right? And there's more on that in a minute. Let me scroll down to the next section. So this next section, right, she talks about, so it not only does it affect women, but it also affects men as well. Men who do not prescribe to these gender roles are determined as weak, right? Men who might have a sense of hysteria that is often associated to females usually have it diagnosed as something completely different. And I'm going to stop there and go off script. I'm going to make a connection to an article that I'm using in one of my other classes called Masculinities Go to College. And it talks about this very same thing, that young males from the time they're born, right, they are trained, their whole goal, right, K through 12 is to try to become the alpha dog, right? And then they want to portray this strength, right? And the problem is when these males decide to go to college, the idea of wanting to seek help, the idea of wanting to share and writing your feelings, it conflicts with what they've been taught. So a lot of these young men who have grown up in this stereotype end up dropping out of college, or as Tyson talks about a little bit later, they actually overcompensate for this and become, right, even they engage in more promiscuous sexual activity. So I just wanted to make that connection because there is a lot of truth to what she's writing about in this paper, in this chapter, and particularly this section right here, which when she makes the case that, right, these gender roles, these rigid male and female gender roles, not only affect the woman, but they also have an effect on the male too. All right. So moving down to the next section on page 87, I chunked it, and I put Tyson talks about how she has experienced real-world examples to argue that patriarchy is still prevalent in today's society. I just shared one with you. She talks about getting whistled at. I mean, this happens all the time. I prescribe to a magazine called Runner's World. There is one issue where they did a poll on the number of women who felt like they were kind of objectified while out on the run, and upwards of somewhere 90%, right? One person I know wanted to have a pool put in. She called the pool man to come out and give an estimate, and the guy must have asked her, 2 or 3 or 4 times, "Is your husband home?" Well, her husband was dead, so obviously he wasn't home. So some of this stuff still goes on today, and that's the point that she's making in that chapter. Okay, moving on to the next section here is, now this is my opinion. Yes, this is true. Right around middle school, girls tend to steer away from math and science disciplines. So in this particular section, she talks about the harmful, right? The harmful natures of a society that has these prescribed gender roles. And one of the prescribed gender roles is for young females aren't supposed to be interested in math or science. Now, I know there are exceptions, but if this weren't true, we wouldn't see these commercials on Super Bowl Sunday where they tell the girl to run like a girl and things like that. And there wouldn't be these public service announcements at all the K through 12 schools trying to encourage our young female students to seek out careers in the math and science, because right around middle school, right, these girls, for whatever reason, are kind of steered away, whether it be intentional or just part of the media. Now, again, obviously there are some exceptions to the rule, but still, this is happening today. Next section here, she talks about, okay, this is the part again that I want to go back and connect to that masculinities article that I talked about, but I've pretty much already talked about it. That it's if a man doesn't live up to the male gender role stereotype, he is seen as weak, right? He's not supposed to show his emotions. He's not supposed to ask for help. Okay. Then continuing on again down this section, Tyson explains that men, as I just mentioned earlier, men will overcompensate for the failure to succeed in college and become the breadwinner society expects them to. So in this article that I was talking about, these young males, that the ones that don't drop out, right? The ones that are able to kind of maintain, even though many of their family and friends suggest that school is for quote unquote sissies and things like that, that they feel obligated to kind of earn a degree that's going to pay well, right? And they're not supposed to kind of pursue a degree in something like the humanities, like art, literature, things like that. So that's what she's talking about there. Going down the next section, she even talks about women, right? Women need to kind of take on these masculine qualities, right? These masculine qualities are needed to be successful in today's world. Even women have to do this. That's what that section talks about. Then she goes into her section on fairy tales, and people, kind of chided her. Well, what's wrong with fairy tales? Why is Cinderella bad? Well, she explains it here. She talks about how fairy tales, right, are criticized because they are harmful for both men and women. Both have to live up to a social norm. Women must rely on the man, right? Their Prince Charming to come save them from something. And the man then must live up to that role of the Prince Charming. And just making a connection to a book that I'm using in one of my classes by Sandra Cisneros, one of the authors that we're reading right now, The House on Mango Street. You see this, right? You see young women at the ages of 13, 14, right? Feeling the pressure that they have to look older. They have to look a certain way, because the only way they're going to get out of their situation and to improve their economic status, right, to get the economic mobility that many people want, is for a man to come rescue them. So this is still prevalent in a lot of cultures. All right, moving down in this next section here, again, she sees problematic. Patriarchy has defined women into categories, either or. You're a good or bad, you're a bitch, or you're an angel. And we see those in the story, right? The story Never Marry a Mexican. We have the female, not only female archetypes, but the female Mexican archetypes. We got La Virgin de Guadalupe, right? She is portrayed as the good woman. We have La Llorona, right? The weeping widow, right? The one that drowned her babies. And then we have La Malinche, right? The traitor. She's the one that sleeps with everybody, right? For her gain, right? So in this section here, Tyson is talking about how that's wrong, right? You are objectifying these women by basically placing these binaries on them, either good or bad. And that's something that you should probably pay attention to as you read this story, right? Because Sandra Cisneros kind of manipulates. She kind of manipulates those female archetypes, right? Are they really either or is there more to it? Okay, and then continuing on, again, this is the whole idea. Patriarchy deems bad girls as promiscuous and good girls as chaste. This is something that's been going on in pop culture forever. I can't remember the exact line, but Christina Aguilera, in one of her famous songs, actually talks about this, right? If a girl sleeps with many guys, she's a slut. And if it's a guy, right, he's a stud or something like that. I'll have to look that up later. But it's something that's still very prevalent today. All right. Next section on page 91 Tyson again argues that labeling women in this way objectifies them, right? If you're labeling them bad or good. Kind of what I just explained. And finally, before we get to the summary of the feminist premises, this last section is, I thought it was interesting. Many of the Victorian ideas are still prevalent today. So Victoria women had to wear a corset, right? So they couldn't feel like anything, like if they felt like excited about a member of the opposite sex and they began to breathe heavy. They wouldn't be able to have these vapes, as it's called in the paragraph. So Tyson is equating today and how women have to wear a mini skirt and high heels, and they have to perform. They have to walk a certain way in the same way that a Victorian woman did when she wore the corset. So I thought that was kind of very interesting. Yeah, the vapors right here. It says, let's go ahead and read that. It says, for example, the extremely tight corsets worn by 19th century women prevented them from getting enough oxygen to be physically active or to experience emotion without getting the vapors, shortness of breath, or slight fits of fainting. And she says that that is analogous to today when a woman puts on a tight skirt and high heels. All right, now you don't have to agree with her. I'm just kind of giving her basic rundown. And even finally, in the end of this section, Tyson talks about that, even women today, even those women that have a career, they still have to juggle the career and they still have to maintain the ideal of the woman stereotypical role, right? They have to come home, prepare the meals, they have to take care of the children and things like that. All right, then that's pretty much the end of my chunking, but I like the assumptions, right? These are kind of a list of assumptions that all feminists share. The first one, women are oppressed by patriarchy economically, politically, socially, and psychologically. I mean, even today, the stats remain, that unless you're in a union, for every dollar that a man makes, a woman makes like 78 cents or something like that. There are people who refuse to vote for Hillary Clinton, right? Even if they were a Democrat, just solely because of the fact that she was a woman and a woman had no place in politics, right? In every domain where patriarchy reigns, woman is the other. She is objectified. We talked about that, right? And all of Western civilization is deeply rooted in patriarchal ideology, as we see in the numerous patriarchal women and female monsters of Greek, Roman literature, even all the way back to the Bible and Eve, things like that. Number 4, while biology determines our sex, male or female, culture determines our gender. And I made that point earlier. That is, for most English-speaking feminists, the word gender refers not to our anatomy, but to our behavior. So that's an important thing that feminists make, right? We all have a sex. We are born male or female, but gender is something that is prescribed, right? Gender are the rules that part of the social norms that have, right, that in many cases, people of certain cultures are kind of forced to believe. Number 5, all feminist activity, including feminist theory and literary criticism, has its ultimate goal to change the world by promoting women's equality. So that's something that we would want to hang on to for our purposes. Number 6, gender issue plays a part in every aspect of human production and experience, including the production and experience of literature, whether we are consciously aware of these issues or not. Right? And then she goes into things that I've already talked about. Like in this part here, Tyson, she advocates that in order to rid society of the patriarchy, it's a battle that's not going to be won or lost in a day, right? It's a series of steps. You take your progress when you can. It isn't an all or nothing scenario. And I think that was it for my chunking. Now she talks about French feminism. She talks about Helen Sixus, who I talked about on my first PowerPoint. So we can get into that later, but that's pretty much it. I just wanted to touch on that. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for listening.